Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of drumming up support. Just a fun little pun on the word drum because this week we are focusing on fantastic, interesting, jaw-dropping drum parts. Today we're going to be looking at some King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. The Wheel is the song we're checking out off of the Gumboot Soup album. I don't think we've heard anything off of this one, so I'm interested to see what King Gizzard is doing this time. Not just generally, but what kind of style they might be exploring. Let's dive into this, see what King Gizzard is bringing to the table today. I have like some Girl from Ipanema vibes. Alright, so we do have some very chill drumming on this, lots of fun snare work, the accents are interesting, the whole thing's a bit laid back. The last section was a nice 7 pulse. Oh, we're still in a 7. Interesting production on the vocals. Oh, that's a very tight roll. Yeah, it's interesting because that's like a stoner production to it. Sort of a funky vibe elsewhere with some blues worked in there. A little all over the place, and somehow they make it work. A lot of overlapping parts. Gets a little busy, but never too convoluted. There's gotta be two drummers on this though, right? Oh, we got an accelerando. To wrap the song up, we're going to increase the energy. Alright, interesting then. That's still a 7, but it has a different feel. Alright, yeah, so just to clarify that ending up, for those who couldn't see how that 7 was the same 7 we had earlier, it's really about pulse and grouping. The first group of 7, I kind of felt in alternating 3 and 4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. But you can also feel it as 3, 3, 1. And that's particularly because they emphasize that 7th beat into the first beat. You have the bum, 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 and you get that double pulse there as we hit 7, 1. So that feels a little groovier, I think, than what we get there at the end, which is accents on 1, 3, 5, and 7. So of course you have the 7 to 1 again. That accent is actually on the hi-hat pedal, closing the hi-hat, and we get tss, 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 and you have that lurch there. You have a consistency of rhythm and then the lurch. And while we kind of have that consistency as well when we accent 1, 4, and 7 and then 1, because of the distance there, we kind of have an idea that we have this 3 pulse and then 3 pulse and then a little stutter, but that stutter kind of makes sense because these pulses have been so large and there's only been 2 of them. So it doesn't feel as odd. It's certainly a little jarring, but it's easier to get into, I think, than having 4 notes, 4 hits that are 2 beats apart to really set this up and then create something odd, which is instead of every other beat, we have every beat. And it's because of the frequency of setting up that pattern initially before the subversion of it that's what makes the ending feel, I think, a bit more jarring. Another thing, though, is that the ending section I count in not necessarily 7, but a type of 4. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and I don't give that 4th beat its full length. And I think a lot of that is because that's where the hi-hat is, that tss, 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 tss. Whereas with the other one, because of the way it's phrased out in groupings of 3, it's easier to feel that 3, 3, 1 or that 3, 4, however you want to go with that, and that just really feels like 7, whereas the ending, like I mentioned, because of the repetition of having those every other beat hits, kind of implies a 4/4 that gets cut short, rather than something that feels like it was custom built for a 7 pulse phrase. So that's kind of neat. They stuck with 7 the whole time, and while like 90% of the song feels pretty similar rhythmically because they don't really change the pulse or anything like that, the ending, they kind of switch things up a little bit. Now, this song is all over the place. I really don't know where to start with it. I mean, it's drum week. We should maybe start with the drums, right? Maybe. I dig what the drums are doing. It's very light, very chill, a lot of, a light attack on most of the hits. There's not really any large strikes in here. Nothing that I would visualize as like big arm movements to hit a drum with the drumstick. A lot of it's really light wrist work to get the sound out without really sounding aggressive with it. This is a cornerstone of a lot of lighter music from the past. We don't really see too much of this in rock or metal these days, which is more goes for the aggressive sound. But for me, I kind of hear a lot of jazz in it. I think some of it is just the general syncopation of the rhythms. It's also the very light. And here's the thing too, right? Jazz can be heavy with snare, but it's usually not. Especially with something like this, which feels somewhere in between swing and lounge and blues. None of those really have a lot of snare work. Fast, upbeat swing, yeah, maybe, but this is definitely not upbeat. Definitely a bit on the chiller side, more relaxed. And so usually wouldn't hear as much snare as the drummer puts into this. But it's not the only influence either. While it does feel jazzy, there's still a lot of other components. We'll get into those in a little bit, but we have some very light cymbal work going on in here and a lot of snare work. I think this is where a lot of the complexity comes from. There is rhythmic complexity when you focus on the cymbals and the drums, the snare, the tom, the bass kick, all of this combined. There's a lot of rhythmic complexity in that, but I think what I find most interesting about it is the use of the snare. The rolls, the quick hits, it's not just ever one strike. Sometimes we'll get two in a row, sometimes we'll get eighth notes, sometimes we'll get a snare roll in the middle of a phrase. All sorts of ways to keep the, well, in a way, keep the intensity up, which is a weird word to use for something as laid back as this song. But the snare drives the song forward. Nothing else really does that. There is a lot of snare work in here. And like I said, there's a lot of technique that goes into it, different rhythms that go into it. And I think as repetitive or as pattern-based as the cymbal and drum kick work tends to be, the snare feels very free through all of that. It feels open. It feels like it can do anything it wants. And I find that to be interesting, where the rest of the kit feels a bit more rigid in what they're doing and the snare feels expressive. Aside from that, though, I think this is an interesting track to pick for Drum Focus Week. It's definitely a bit unusual. I don't think you would hear this exact pattern pretty much anywhere else. So it definitely fits the theme of the week, but I don't know, especially after yesterday's track, which I can't even remember what band that was, but they kind of blew me away. So for this to be delicately intricate, I think is a really nice juxtaposition to what we had yesterday. A bit of a swinging to the opposite side of the spectrum, still complex in its own right, but not jaw-dropping, not, immediately noticeable that this takes a high amount of skill. I think a lot of it comes down to the nuance. It comes down to inflection. There's a lot of accented hits in here that run up against non-accented hits. It creates this dynamic flow throughout the drum part, where you kind of rise up in intensity, kind of dip down in intensity where there's less things going on, and then we kind of bring it back up with maybe a snare roll and then a snare accent, kind of bring it back down a little bit, and then a crash cymbal is going to bring it up, and it feels conversational, where there's high points and there's low points to the speech. You don't really get this too often with drums. They're usually at a single intensity as far as volume, as far as layers, as far as how much is going on. A verse is just going to be flat. A chorus is going to be flat. They might be different levels of flat. Maybe the chorus is higher than the verse as far as intensity or volume goes. But there's not a lot of nuance to it. And I think that's what the drummer brings in. It's that sort of invisible skill, where this seems a bit easier than it is. And you try to play it and you're like, dang, how's this guy do it? Just less of a spectacle, I suppose would be the word. And it even caught me off guard. It took me kind of talking my way through that to come around to this, because it does, even for me, it feels like a simple drum part, and it isn't. There's a lot of hidden complexity. If you want to play it correctly, you could obviously just muscle your way through it and play everything at the same intensity, and not have all the dynamic nuance to it. And yeah, most people might not notice, but the drummer for King Gizzard would. He'd be like, "Yeah, that's not a great cover. You didn't do that very well. You missed a lot of what makes it special." Now, the rest of the band also leans into this laid back element. The guitars kind of vamping on a chord. We have some movement on one of the guitars. I think the bass gives us walking bass lines, a little bit of arpeggiation here and there. Definitely creates a low floor for everything, but directs the band as well. There's also an organ that pops up at times. The organ's an interesting thing for me. It sounds very psychedelic rock, but it's the only thing in here that kind of brings that in, and so I'm not sure how to interpret it. It was an interesting timbre when I first heard it, been intrigued by its inclusion. By the end of the song, I still wasn't quite sure what the purpose of it was. I mean, as far as musicality, yeah, its part was pretty cool. It added counterpoint to the song, added harmony to what the guitar was doing at times. It kind of danced around and filled in a lot of roles as far as supplementary music goes. But its specific timbre, it eludes me. Not because it's wrong, but because it fits. And I don't know how or why. King Gizzard are just musical wizards. It's I don't know, this isn't the first time that they've introduced kind of a bizarre decision in their writing that was absolutely the right thing to do, but like on paper, like, no, that wouldn't work. How'd they make it work? The organ, I think, is one of them. And I think it's particularly because of the organ sound. I think if we had used a piano there, would not have been as jarring for me. And it's not even just any organ, it's the very specific 60s rock organ. It evokes a specific sound and era and feeling that the rest of the song doesn't. And I think this is where we need to talk about how everything else comes into place here. There is, as I said, a sort of jazzy, bluesy, swing kind of thing going on, a little bit of lounge in there as far as the drums are concerned. So it's a little more rock oriented, but it still kind of captures a lot of that with its syncopation and cymbal usage. The bass definitely feels very jazzy to me, but there's a funkiness to the rhythms that we hear out of the organ and the guitar. It brings in a lot of syncopation that jumps off of and expands on the syncopation that the drums are bringing in. Beyond that, I think that there's also a stoner rock element. I guess that kind of fits in with the psychedelic vibe a little bit. This comes primarily from some of the harmonies. I think particularly from the guitar. The organ tone doesn't do it any favors, though it definitely makes me think of that. But then when I listen to the vocals and how they're harmonizing against all the music placed underneath it, I don't know where to place this song anymore. And at this point, I just have to accept that this is King Gizzard core. And if that's not a real subgenre, well, it shouldn't be, because I don't think it's very descriptive, and I've been pretty harsh on non-descriptive genres in the past, but I do think it's rather accurate. As I mentioned, King Gizzard does this thing where they take things that on paper shouldn't work and then make them work, and they do it very well consistently across a plethora of styles and artistic decisions that it kind of feels like they're in a realm of their own at times. And I think this song is one of them. How did they bring all these disparate ideas together and create something that works? It has drive, but it's also laid back. It's chill, but it has some intensity to it. It's palatable, but it's also not at times. It's a bit more avant-garde harmonically. And even with the layers, as I said there at the end, they can get rather messy. Nothing that ever breaks the song, nothing that gets too convoluted, but there is a lot going on towards the end, and the instruments start to step on each other's toes a little bit production-wise. I probably would have went with a little bit more room on it, but maybe this sort of cluttering of sound was what they wanted at the end of this track. It's a confusing mess, which I think is probably the wrong phrase for it, but I think accurately sums up my idea here. This is splatter artwork right here, where it's not immediately noticeable what it might mean or represent. It's not really easy to understand or digest because it's kind of abstract, but at the same time it works. It is effective. Why are all these things brought together? How do they work? Why, what led them to creating this specific sound? But at the end of the day, none of those questions really matter because it's good to listen to. I enjoyed my time with it, despite not really getting it. It still clicks, and I think that's the the King Gizzard magic right there. Which I guess I'm misattributing this. I suppose it'd be the lizard wizard that has the magic, but that's a bad joke. Let me look at some lyrics here. A segue away from that. We'll forget I ever said that ridiculous line. Now, I think this song is about how easy it is for us to lose track of the destination in order for a hyper focus on the journey. I don't know if that's necessarily what they're particularly leaning towards, but that's what I get out of it. The chorus and the refrain say that we only sleep at the wheel that steers us into the future. We fall asleep willingly at the wheel that steers us into the future. So when we have control over where the future takes us, we fall asleep. We choose not to have any control over where our life goes. It says, our minds unpack, our muscles relax, we are superfluous and in a stupor. Now, interestingly, the verse is sung by a different person than the chorus, and I never picked up on that at all. I thought this was all sung by the same person. The verses are all 4 lines long, with line 3 and 4 being the same. We'll get to that in a second, but I do think that's an interesting idea here, to have this loop of making sure that every verse is a continuation of a single thought. Verse 1, though, says that there's help in need. We seek to retreat, yet we decline without mercy. So we need help, and instead of accepting help, we'll decline it and instead seek retreat, to withdraw within ourselves. The last half of the verse says, destroying all that will keep us heading for a better thesis. Now, the idea of a better thesis, I think, is interesting, and I can't directly follow through what's going on here, but I generally believe that what's being said here is a better future. I'm not sure how those two words might relate, but the idea, again, is that we don't do the things we need to do to ensure we have a better future. We don't make the choices we should make. We are proverbially, what is that word? Proverbially? There we go. Proverbially asleep at the wheel. Now, verse 2 says, shivering pilgrims climb the steeper path to the idealistic reaper. I like this idea. A pilgrim would be one who, crosses a vast amount of space in order to arrive somewhere. And it says that they purposefully climb the steeper path. They make things more difficult on themselves in order to get to an idealistic reaper. I'm not too sure about what the metaphor here is about the idealistic reaper, how that might separate them from a more of a general reaper, one who would take your life, usher you to the afterlife. But the idea here is still that they would take a more difficult path to reach a less optimal ending. Again, people getting in the way of their own better future. And that's generally what I get out of this. There is a lot of repetition of falling asleep at the wheel that stares us into our future, and each of the verses talks about how people take the more difficult path. They make decisions that are not prosperous. They intentionally fall asleep at the wheel. They have full control over where they can go, and they choose to relinquish that and just kind of end up wherever they go. Which is interesting for a song that I kind of described as chill and going with the flow and just existing. It's a song that kind of doesn't have a lot of direction aside from that snare accent, which, like I said, provides a momentum that the song doesn't. And I wonder if the song is supposed to not be representing an ideal path, but the path that most people take. One of just being chill and laid back and not really directing anything. Those are just my thoughts, though, on The Wheel by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. What did you think of this song? Is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that you would like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Maybe you have your own thoughts, opinions, and perspective on this track. Let me know. Put all that stuff down in the comments section. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. We'll continue on with this week's theme of checking out really cool drum parts. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.